Listen up, we are so thankful you're here, and I think we do have a speaker, and he's right behind me. Thank you. All right, Pastor.
Well, good morning, everyone. Nice to be with Frozen Chosen. We had, by the way, those of you who joined us for ice skating on Friday night, that was just great at the rinks there, and I was kept my feet on the land versus the ice, but it was great. It was really great. So thanks for joining us. We're in Romans chapter 7 today. So if you have a Bible, turn to Romans chapter 7. And this morning I'm going to begin a new series on change. And it really ties in with our theme for the year, which is this. 2025 is a grace for a new beginning. And I believe that God really has a new beginning for you, a new beginning for us. And what does that even look like? What's a new beginning? Well, maybe that new beginning for you is a new direction or a new focus, a new passion. Maybe the new beginning is just a fresh start. But I think what makes the new beginning different than typical new beginnings, because most people at the beginning of the year, they're like, I got a New Year's resolution, I'm going to do this, is this. It's not about that at all. It's this. It's grace for new beginning. So it's not your power, but it's God's power to allow that new beginning to happen. So it doesn't depend on you. It's God giving you the power to experience that new beginning. So the work of God's grace in your life. So what does that kind of change look like? Well, a few years ago, I was invited to attend an AA anniversary meeting where a member of our congregation, Steve Konechny, got it. Is that right, Steve? No, he doesn't even want to know. Okay, let's call him Steve the landscaper, but that's an easier way. But anyways, Steve was celebrating 29 years of sobriety, and it had been my first AA meeting to attend, and I was blown away, first of all, by Steve and the God story that he had shared about really how he has experienced change, not just change for a month or change for a year, but years of change, walking it out. And so I was so impressed by that, I asked him if he would share a little bit with us. And he did a video for us, and I'd like for you to take a look at a very small part of Steve's story, and just to really see the change that God can produce in a person's life. Take a look. And Steve, obviously, if they don't have the video, you got to come up and share. No, I'm not doing that. No, it says it's under current media. I had instructions there for. Okay, Steve, we're going to get back to you in a moment. So if you go to OneDrive, current media, current Sunday media, you can download that, yeah, and then kind of put it in. Just give me a high side whether I should continue or wait. Just let me know. And it's not the long one, by the way. It's under current Sunday media. The other one is 15 minutes. So we kind of let it go down a little bit. Well, let me just say this while they're kind of putting it up here. I think within all of us, there's a deep desire to change and to experience change, right? And yet, at the same time, what happens is we struggle to follow through on the change that we want to make. And why is it that we struggle? We know we want to change, and maybe we know that we need to change, and yet when it comes to following through on change, why? Why are we challenged with that? Especially since, by the way, change is something you have to do throughout your entire life. It's not like you just change once in one area. Our society is constantly changing, and we're constantly changing as we go through seasons of our life. And I think that one of the reasons why that we struggle with change is that healthy change, by the way, usually involves a level of discomfort. By the way, unhealthy change doesn't. We're totally comfortable with unhealthy change. No, but as far as healthy change, though, we want to make healthy changes, right? I mean, nobody says this, hey, listen, I am super fit, and my new goal is to be unfit. So I'm just going to lay back and eat chips and watch whatever. No, we don't do that. No, those are not the kinds of changes we want to make. We want to make healthy changes. But that kind of change usually requires some discomfort. That's why weight loss is really a difficult thing for us to follow through. And the hardest one, why? Because it's discomfort. You've got to change what you eat. You have to discover what a vegetable is again. One of those things. You've got to work out. We know that involves some discipline and some pain. And you've got to put it on your calendar. You've got to keep a food journal. You've got to attend meetings where people help you work through the change. It's uncomfortable. That's one of the reasons why we don't follow through, is because change oftentimes in our life is uncomfortable. But the number one reason, by the way, and by the way, you guys still working on that, just give me a high side. The number one reason, by the way, that we change is not necessarily we change because we're intentional about it. You know why we change? Thank you. We change because of pain. Now, it's been said, by the way, you change because of one of two forces. You either change when you see the light or you feel the heat. And most of us change when we feel the heat. Right? And so here it is, you're eating you're not eating in a healthy way, and until you end up getting a diagnosis from the doctor, then you decide to make a change. And you should spend more time with your kids, but here's what happens. One day, your son or your daughter comes up to you and says, why do you spend so much time on the phone? Or why are you always at work? And it just kind of cuts you. And what do? You say, well, listen, I'm going to change. Or your spouse says this. If that doesn't change, I'm out. What happens? We change. So when we feel the pain, we make a change. But here's the problem with pain-induced change. Is that oftentimes when the pain is there, we change. What happens when the pain lightens up? We stop changing. And so it will only change to the level of pain at that point. And so the change is really not permanent. Oftentimes the change it's temporary. Why? Because it's based on pain. There's got to be a better way than short-term changes. And then when we don't change it, we feel really guilty. We feel ashamed that I didn't really change. Oh, thank you. So maybe you've made some incremental change. But here it is. Change is possible if we look at change a different way. What if change is not about behavior? What if change is spiritual? Well, let's take a look at Steve's story here.
I'm Steve, and I am an alcoholic, and I went to AA, and I started with my father was an alcoholic too. So I said I swore I wouldn't be like him, and I ended up just like him. So at 30 years old, I had my third DWI, well, it's actually 29. I had my third DWI, and I had to ride a bicycle. So I rode a bicycle, and I cut my lawyer's lawn for 2 years on a bicycle with a little lawn boy, a weed whacker, and a blower. So long story short, I got my license back. I went to the DMV, had to wait 6 months for every DWI, and I had to go to the counseling and stuff, and so my sister came there, and the judge goes to her, 5,000, she starts crying, I start crying, and he's like, well, I don't know why I'm doing this, but you have 500? So he let me go on 500, and then that was it ever since. So, I got my license back, and then I bought a truck and fixed it up, and then I grew up being a landscaper. My father was a landscaper. So that's how I know what I know. That's why I have the green thumb. His name actually was Frank's Green Thumb. That was the name of his business, and that was like in the 60s and 70s. So I used to go with him when I was 5 years old. I loved using the machines. I still do today. So I have a little business today. I'm 35 years sober. It's from having nothing to having something today. It's amazing. I put down the drink. I went to AA, and I do have a pretty good life. I have Great Danes. I have 4-bedroom house. I drive around in a brand new Ford Raptor, and the relationships I have with people are like unbelievable. You're not going to get along with everybody. You know, I try to, but you know. I broke my leg. I broke my femur. I fell off a ladder. I smashed up my truck. You know, I didn't do it. Somebody hit me, and so I said to my friend Johnny, which I'm sure most of you know. He used to sell bagels. I won't say a full name, but so he told me to come here, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm Catholic. I was born Catholic. You know, he goes, let's try it. I said, all right. I came here, and I fell in love. You know, so I've been a member here ever since. I don't know, like 10, 12 years or whatever.
That's right. That
I've been coming here, and I even do the lawn out, so I know it's full of weeds now, but. What a life, you know, God has given me. God is the best. And he works through people.
That's right.
You know, and it's amazing. What a life. So.
What a life. I still remember, Steve, you were right where James is first time I met you. And that's when you had broken your femur, and I'll never forget, that was the beginning of a story. That God had been writing and writing and writing God's story. It's just amazing, the change. So a lot of us, we experience change in our life sometimes, but because it's been this change that doesn't seem to stick, for some of us, we kind of feel like this. Have you ever tried to change and you fail? I try to change, I fail. Try to change, I fail. And then what happens is we just kind of get discouraged with the whole process. We think, you know what? I can't change. I'm just going to be me. This is who I am, and I'm not going to change. And that's a lie. Some of you have given up on change, and you feel like you're stuck. But you feel like you're the only one who's stuck. But I have good news for you. At some point in our lives, all of us have felt like we're stuck and we can't seem to change. And so here's where Romans chapter 7 comes in. So turn there. Romans chapter 7, the Apostle Paul, one of the heroes of our faith, he wrote most of the New Testament. And this is what he's going to describe about his own struggle with change on a very deep level. He says this, and you can follow along up there. He says, so the trouble is with me, for I'm all too human. I'm a slave to sin. In other words, that's where the brokenness was. The brokenness was this little word called sin, which has got tremendous power. And he says, I really don't understand myself. For I want to do what's right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know I'm doing wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. In other words, God's instruction for us is to get another microphone so as not to drive the congregation crazy. I think, by the way, this microphone has it in for me. Same mic last week, and it worked fine.
I believe that God's instruction is good. So I'm not the one who's doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. That's what I'm battling. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. I want to do what's right, but I can't. I want to do what's good, but I don't. I don't want to do what's wrong, but I do it anyway. Does that sound familiar? Verse 20, but if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me. So again, that's what he's saying where the battle is. In verse 21, he says, I've discovered this principle of life. And I'm like, yay, Paul, what's the principle you discovered? And here's what he says. When I want to do what's right, I inevitably do what's wrong. In other words, I want to change, but there's a struggle to make that change. I love God's law with all my heart. In other words, he's saying, listen, what you've laid out for me, those instructions, they're good and I love them. But he says this, there's another power within me that's at war with my mind. That power makes me a slave to sin. That's still within me. And he says this, verse 24, oh, what a miserable person I am. Another translation says, oh, what a wretched man I am. Yeah, that's a tough day, right? When you do all that, in the end of the day, you're saying, what a wretched man I am. But then he doesn't end there. He says, who will free me from this life that's dominated by sin and death? Thank God. The answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. He's saying this, the way that you experience change, the way that you experience lasting change is through Jesus Christ, our Lord. I just want to take a couple minutes just to talk about what's it mean that Jesus is the power to change. See, I think one of the things that happens when it comes to change is we can think of change as saying, listen, change is really just a matter of your will. You set your mind to do something and you do it. And I'm not minimizing the power of somebody's will. A lot of things people do by their own willpower, but the kind of change here is spiritual transformation. So what if change really is spiritual? What if it's not about behavior modification as much as it is about transformation spiritually? That's what Josh talked about last week. He talked about abiding. And if you abide in the vine, in Jesus, you know what's going to happen? Fruit's going to come out of your life. So it's not as if the branch has to say, grow fruit, grow fruit. It doesn't need to, no. It grows fruit as a result of abiding the vine. So next couple of weeks, we're going to look at the theology of pain. Or theology of change, excuse me. What does that look like? What does it look like? So I'd encourage you just to say, listen, over the next 5 weeks, what I'd like to do, one's going to build on the other. What does change look like and how does change happen in my life? So here's what the theology of change looks like. It has to do with this word that's used in the Bible. You're not going to hear it a whole lot outside of the Bible. It's called sanctification. A big word, sanctification. So what does sanctification, what does that word mean? Well, when you come to the place in your life where you recognize, yeah, there's a battle that's going on inside of me, and it's because of that little word sin. Well, what you recognize is that Jesus came, lived a perfect life, and what he did was he died, not only to forgive us of our sins, but he died to free us from the power of sin over us, so we no longer need to be a slave to sin. And in that sense, sin divides us. It always divides you. Sin divides us from God. It separates us from God. Listen, sin divides us from each other. When somebody sins against you, they hurt you. And you hurt them. And then you know what sin does? Sin also messes with us, ourselves. We start thinking wrong things about ourselves. I think it's just sin makes you stupid. You don't see things about yourself. In the story, we didn't show this, but Steve said, listen, even though he had 3 DWIs, he was like, I'm not an alcoholic. There's a denial. Every alcoholic, there's a denial. Why? That's sin is a denial. And so what happened was God did something through Jesus. And here's what he did. When we receive Christ into our life, God looks at us now through Jesus and he says, you know what? You are holy. What's that mean? You're separated. You're part of the chosen. I've chosen you for me. And so it's like now we have become part of God's team. We're part of God's family. We're part of God's army, and we're holy. But what happens is that holy is not just a one-time event. that holy has to do with covenant relationship. It has to do with a journey. So listen, one of the great joys that I have is to be able to be with a couple right here. And they're standing in front of me. And I say, do you take so-and-so to be your wife or husband? You know what they say? I do. But I can tell you right now, that's not the last time they say I do. That isn't the end. That's the beginning of a journey. And in the same way, our relationship with God, that's the beginning of a journey. So he says, I declare you holy. But then what he's saying is, at that point, sanctification is the process by which we become more holy. It's not just a one-time event, but we're drawn into this relationship which makes us holy. And holiness and sanctification are about change. God is changing. There's a continuous process in our life of changing. So Jerry Bridges, who's an author and he's a theologian, he's written some books. One of the books is called The Discipline of Grace. And in the book, he says this. A lot of times what happens is we often mistake how God does this process of change in our life. He says there are two classic mistakes that we make, and then there's a way that we actually do change, that God works change in our life. And so one of the first mistakes that we have in our mindset is the way that God works in our life is this, that it's God, then you. It's God, then you. That's how God changes. And that's a wrong mindset. It's kind of like the mindset that the deists had. You know, Thomas Jefferson was a deist. What was a deist? The best way to understand a deist thought of God as a clockmaker. What he did was God created the world, right? It was beautiful. And he wound up the clock. And then he said, okay, have at it. It's your turn, right? I did it. Now you work it out. And so the same thing about this mistaken belief is this. Once you've given your life to Jesus, fine. Now you're on your own. I got to try harder. I got to push harder. It's up to me to make the change. And so I have to make sure now that I'm a Christian, I have to try not to get angry. I have to try not to have a meltdown. But that's what happens if you believe that change takes place when, it starts with God, but then it's up to me. It's all on me. And I'll tell you right now, we end up feeling like we're never enough. We can never do enough. And it's absolutely exhausting. So we'll look at a verse like Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, and he says this. He says, work out your salvation, Paul says this. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You said, see? It's up to me now. God did it, now it's up to me. But you have to look at the second part of the verse that says this. For it is God who is at work in our life, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So listen, God's at work all the time. It's not just God, then you. It's God who's working all the time in our life. So that's the first incorrect mindset. The second incorrect mindset would be the opposite. So it's not like God, then me. It goes something like this. It's all God. And I don't have anything to do with change. Change is all God, and it's not me at all. Well, that's a mistake, because then it's like, change is, I'm just going to let go and let God. I know that my spouse and we need to go and see a counselor, but I'm just going to let God change her. And that's what you do. You pray, oh, God, change my wife. She needs so much change. So God, change her. Now, guys, you've ever prayed that prayer about your wife? I got to tell you right now, that doesn't work out so well, okay? Because she's praying the same thing. Or, God, I'm just gonna let God, you do it, God. I'm gonna spend. How are you gonna pay for it? Let go and let God, Where I've got all this credit card debt. I know I've got a mortgage beyond what I can afford. I bought that coat. I can't afford to buy the coat. But I bought it. Why? Why'd you buy the coat? Because God's going to provide. And you know what? I'm going to pray over that lottery ticket that when I scratch it off, there it is, God's going to show up that way. So it's all God. It's not me, that mindset. So if it's not all God and not me, or if it's God, then me. If it's not that either, then what is it? And here's what it is. You want to know how real change happens? It's God through you. God through me. God's working in me, but God's working through me. That's how change happens. That's how lasting change happens. And when you understand how God's working through you, change begins to take place. And that's where you find the power to change. So the same Paul's like really wrestling in Romans chapter 7, where he ends up saying, what a miserable man I am, but thank God, change is happening because of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you'd like to turn there, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says this, "For I am the least of all the apostles. I don't even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God." So what's Paul talking about? He was talking about before he met Jesus and encountered Jesus, Paul was right there. He was overseeing the killing of those people who would be followers of the way, followers of Jesus. So this person, Paul, who planted churches, he was an apostle. He traveled all around. This apostle, he said, but that isn't how I began. I began trying to kill followers of Jesus. I want to shut down the Jesus movement. So I don't deserve to be called an apostle. In fact, I'm the last person who should be found by Jesus. But then he goes on to say, and these words are incredibly important. He says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. So God's grace is at work. By God's grace, I am what I am. Now, most of us understand grace to be a gift, which it is. Grace is a gift that's unmerited, it's undeserved. So our salvation is by God. He says, listen, it's unmerited, it's undeserved. You don't deserve it, you don't earn it. You receive it as a gift. But it's more than that. There's another definition of grace, because he says his grace to be was not without effect. In other words, the grace of God is doing something in him. The grace of God is doing something in you. And what's it doing? Well, Paul goes on to say this. He says, it's continuing to change me and transform me. He says, listen, I worked harder than them all. And when you look at Paul, he probably did. Paul was shipwrecked. Paul was beaten. Paul was in prison, yet he kept on planting churches. So Paul was like a high-octane individual. He was going. Well, where did he get the power to do that? He says it's the power of God's grace operating in me. So Craig Groeschel put it this way. He said, the grace that saves you is also the grace that wants to continue to change you. How are you changed? You're changed by the grace of God working through you. And it's not change. Lasting change, my friend, is not about behavior modification. Lasting change is about spiritual transformation. That's God working through you. So that's what Paul says. God working through me. Grace working through me gives me the power to change. So one of the ways that this kind of spoke to me was actually through my snowblower. So I have a snowblower. I call it Big Red. And the problem with Big Red is Big Red didn't really like snow for a while. So I don't know, you have one of those significant snowfalls, and I'd fire it up, and it just didn't like snow. And it would just putter out, wouldn't shoot it, right? So I ended up shoveling the driveway. It's a long driveway. And so a couple years ago, I actually had it serviced. What's wrong? Big Red does not like snow. Likes to be just stored in the shed, and then it comes out at winter, and just that's it. So I said, you got to do something. So he actually helped me, and he fixed a part in the snowblower. And now, you know what happened? We had 5 inches, a few weeks ago, we had 5 inches. I took Big Red out. It fired up. It went like this, and it shot the stuff out. And so what happened was my driveway dramatically changed. Not because of me, not because of my own willpower, not because I did it in my own power. You know who did it? Big Red. So what happens is this. God's grace in us is like Big Red that empowers us to change. And it empowers us to experience change in our life. It is tapping into God's power. That's what grace is. When you say, I need to change, God says, okay, there's a power within you that I've given. So spiritual change is purpose-driven change. It is not pain-driven change. See, most pain-driven change is not intentional. It's not intentional. What happens? Pain comes into your life, and you change. You didn't set out before to change because there's no pain. So pain was the thing, as I said before, that was the catalyst, but it wasn't intentional pain. It wasn't intentional change. What happens is this, though. What would happen if you had intentional change? What if you had spiritual purpose behind your change? So what I want to do next couple of minutes is this. I want to help you to understand how God really changes us from within and how his grace helps us. And one of the ways it helps us is, and the way that we change is not just, you can't just identify your what when it comes to change. You have to identify the why behind your what. Most of us say, listen, Nicholas, these are the areas of my life I need to change, blah, 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 blah. But it's not enough for you just to know what you want to change. Why do you want to change? What's the purpose behind your change? And that's a really important facet of change. It's when you understand the why, it changes everything. Because the why is the purpose. The why is the calling. Pain-driven change is temporary. But purpose-driven behavior is permanent. So some of you know my story, and my story starts this way. I went to school for music. I was going to be a music teacher, and I graduated. Joy and I, God led us to a church in which I became a minister of music. In fact, I served in 2 churches before starting Church on the Sound as a minister of music. And that's what I did. But somewhere along the line, between the 2 pastors, I served under 2 pastors, they were like totally different. The one pastor, he was a really nice guy. He was very much about like status, and we were part of a denomination, and he would always refer to the denomination. And he was a wonderful man. Like, he met people well. He's involved in everything. That was him. But one thing he couldn't do is he couldn't really teach. So his messages were like, okay. But then the other pastor said, okay, the other pastor I served under for 5 years, he was just the opposite. He was a very strong visionary, a type A leader, and he could teach. He would teach for an hour straight, and everybody just loved it. The problem with him was he loved to teach, he just didn't like people. So that created a problem, right? Because he wanted to make sure you got it, right? He just didn't want to. And he'd say things like, hey, listen, you don't like it? They'd offend him. Let me throw a brick at him. I'm like, what? Yeah. People leave, he'd be like, yeah, don't let the door hit your backside. I'm like, okay. So I'm saying, so here's the deal. So at this time, like I'm leading in worship, and all of a sudden I feel like God's just calling me, right? He's calling me. He's calling me. He has purpose for me. And basically, what was his purpose for me? He says this, you're going to be a shepherd. That's what you're going to be. There's a lot of brokenness in the world, and people need healing. And that's what you're called to do. You're not called here. You're not called here. This is what you're called to be. And he even kind of revealed it in the name of the church. So we named the church Church on the Sound. Those of you who are kind of new to the area, you probably know, I don't know, the Sound's nowhere near here, right? It's like 4 miles down the road. So what's up with that? What were you thinking of when you... And God just made it so clear to me about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. He said, listen, you don't get it. It's not about the location. It's about the character of the community. This is going to be a place where God wants to do healing in people's lives. He wants to bring wholeness into people's lives. That's what Sound is. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's good. So do you understand? But that's God defining for me, not just my what, but my why. Why are you here? Why have you done this for 40 years here? Why? The why is because I've been called to be a shepherd, called to be a pastor. You see? God has a lot of whys. He's got a lot of purposes in the scripture. And you see it throughout the scripture. So my why is my why, but here, what would your why be? Maybe your why is that you say, listen, you've got these kids that God has blessed you with. And that becomes part of your why. I need to spend more time with my children. I'm a parent. That's your what. What's your why? My why is this. I'm the only parent that God has put in the life of my child to train them up. You're called to be their parent. You have influence over them. And the influence is, it's over their entire life, but boy, there's a specific time where you have the most influence to pour into their life. That's a calling. For others of you, you have an incredible ability to lead, and God's gifted you with. He's graced you with it. So that's your what. You're a manager of a store. That's your what. But what's your why? Why are you there? And you know why you're there? It's because God needs a representative, and he picked you. And you're there to inspire. You're there to motivate. You're there to lead like Jesus led. You're not there to step on people and to control, manipulate them. No, you're there. You're there to say, listen, I want to lift you up. We're part of a team, and I want to make you better. And so you create a totally different atmosphere. That's a calling. That's your purpose. So God's got purpose, all sorts of purpose for us. You know, James, by the way, James Engelbert, he's here today, and James has an art. He's going to have an art exhibit next Saturday in Setauket. You go take a look. We have a poster there. Well, you know what? James is an artist, among other things. James is an artist. That's his what. I'll tell you right now, there's a why that extends beyond James's what. You have a why that's behind your what. And the greater that the more you discover why, that will help you to change. We don't just change because of our what. You change because of your why. I've got purpose. I've got a calling. So start looking for someone who's got a passion to define their why, not just their what. So after you define your what and you define your why, then you have to define your how. So how do I change? I know why. How do I change? And we talked about this a little bit before in Romans chapter 7. Basically, Paul says this: Christ in me is stronger than the wrong desires in me. So let's go back to the parent. So you come back from work, it's a really hard day, you pull up in the driveway, and here's what happens. You're like so tired. I just want to spend time alone. I've been with people all day, I want to spend time alone. But you know what? There's a family inside that house that needs me. And I'm tired, but I'll tell you what, I'm not going to give them leftovers. Christ in me is stronger than the wrong desires in me. And when you come home, you've been really stressed. You just want to pick up the phone and just doom scroll until you don't even know what time it is. Christ in you is stronger than those desires. They're just going to pull you away. So when it comes to sanctification, you know that word, it's not just changing what we do. A lot of times we just feel like, if I just change what I want to do, change what I need to do. So as a Christian, we say, we're going to change. Read your Bible more, pray more, serve people more, volunteer more. No. It's more than that. Sanctification basically is saying this. God's not looking at just changing things that you do. He says, it's changing the very affection of your heart. The affection for the person of Jesus and for the things of Jesus. Listen, I'm going to put my affections on him. And I'm going to put my affections on the people that he's placed around me. I'm going to place my affections on the things that he's called me to do. Behavior modification is temporary. But you set your affection on God and his purpose for you, I'll tell you what, that change will be lasting. It won't be temporary. So here's your assignment, by the way. I've got an assignment for you this week. And the first assignment is pretty easy. What is the one thing in my life that I want to change? One thing. Say, Nicholas, one thing? I got about 10 things. Do you hear me? One thing. What about 2 things? One thing. What's the one thing? And I want to carry that one thing over the next 5 weeks. One thing. This is the one thing that I want to change. Just pick one. That's what I want to see change. This. The second thing is related to the why. What's the why behind my what? What's the purpose? What's the purpose? What's the purpose behind my what? In a couple weeks, Jewish people from around the world will be celebrating what's known as Purim. It's a week-long feast, and it goes back to the days of Queen Esther. Esther had her what? You know what her what was? I'm the queen. I happen to be Jewish, and there's an evil man named Haman. And if you're ever been part of a Purim play, anytime you say the word Haman, everybody in the audience goes, boo, right? Because Haman's bad, okay? So boo. But Haman was evil. He's more than bad. And he tricked the king into placing this decree that on a certain day, every Jewish person, there would be a mass genocide. And so what happened was Esther's relative Mordecai, she explains the situation to him, and he says, listen, you're the only one who has access to the king, you, the queen. So you're to go in and you're going to tell him what's happening. You're going to reveal it. And he uses this famous line on Esther. He says, but who knows that you have been brought into the kingdom for such a time as this? In other words, Esther, your what is the queen. Your why, your purpose is literally to save an entire race. That's what your purpose is. And Esther comes through. And she does that, and the Feast of Purim recognizes the salvation of an entire race because Esther stood and Esther did the purpose that God had really called her to do. So what's your purpose? What's your purpose? What's your why? What do you need to change and why? You say, Nicholas, I need to change because I want to be there for my children. I want to be there for my grandchildren. I need to change the way that I deal with my finances so that not only do I have the finances in order, I'm able to use the finances to bless people. Listen, a guy named Todd Bennett in 1980, he was basically a consultant to a company that was dealing with retirement benefits, right? But he's really struggling because what he saw was, he said, you know what? What's happening is people, the people who are managing are more interested on them benefiting than their employees actually benefiting. So there was an article by Market Watch, and it said this: most religious men find answers to their prayers in Scripture. Todd Bennett found them in the U.S. tax code. So he's fed up with these clients, right? They got the maximum tax break. For themselves, they did very little for their employees. And so he's wrestling. He's saying, listen, I don't know if I can work for you and be a Christian because the two of them are not working. They're not compatible so he's crying out to God. What do I do? Do I quit the job, do something else? Because I can't do this. And what happened was he goes over the IRS tax code and he finds it had been in the tax code all along, but nobody had actually seen it. He says, wait a minute, there's a way in which employees are able to take money and have money set aside for them that is tax-free for their retirement. In other words, they're going to gain a great benefit from this money that they are able to have put into an account tax-free until you retire. And you know what it was called? How many of you here have a 401k? It was Todd Benna, this guy who's saying, God, what's your purpose for me? That was his purpose. You see how purpose matters a great deal. And purpose involves change. So do you know your why behind your what? And then third, remind yourself of your how. Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, God says to him, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. My power is not made perfect in your strength. My power is not made perfect in your self-help. My grace is sufficient. So listen, Jesus is really not looking for you to be more self-made. He's looking for you to be more surrendered. You're surrendered. Jerry Bridges, by the way, in The Discipline of Grace, has this quote that is really, it's a great quote. He says this: your worst days are never so bad that you are beyond the reach of God's grace. So just to remember, you say, listen, you don't understand, Nicholas. There's a lot of stuff that I bring in terms of what I need to change. I'm a mess. Your worst days are not beyond the reach of God's grace. Your worst days are not beyond the reach of God's grace. But then there's another part. He says this: your best days are never so good that you are beyond the need of God's grace. So lasting change is saying, God, show me what I need to change. Show me the why behind. Give me the purpose. And then let me know it's going to be your power working in me that sees the change happen. Kabish? Okay, I'd like to invite the worship team to come. And I just want you to say, okay, even if right now you're able to say, this is the one thing in my life I want to change. This is one thing. And then ask God right now, just say, God, what's the purpose behind that change? What is your purpose behind that change? And God, remind me about the power to change. It's your grace that's going to give me the power to change. Grace is an incredibly powerful word because grace is about God's power that is working through you. Have you ever had someone go through a crisis in which something really horrible happened? They had a loss in their life, and you said to yourself, listen, I would never be able to get through that. Never. If that ever happened to me, I'd never get through it. And you know what? You're right. You wouldn't get through it. You know why? Because you're not in it and you didn't need the grace for it. It's grace on demand. When you're in the situation, I got to tell you right now, I've been to situations and you've been in situations where something happened and it was like a knife inside of you. You said, God, I need your grace. And God never fails. He comes through with supernatural strength, supernatural ability for you to be able to get through what you never thought you would get through. That's grace. Do you understand? That's how you get through it. That's how you change, is when you say, God, I need grace. I need grace. So let me pray with you before we have the worship team close us out. Jesus, I want to thank you that we are not left with change being just something that I have to do it. It's all on me. No, God, you've given us a resource. You said, my grace is sufficient. My grace is enough. It's there. And you getting from point A to point B there's purpose. And just receive God's grace right now. Say, God, I receive it. I receive your power. Because now it's not me. It's you working through me that's going to see the change take place. Thank you for grace. Thank you for grace.